Hey everybody! About 2 months ago I started with this new tier in my Patreon pages, and with this video I hope to pique your interest in what will be investigated when talking about rebirth experiences and rites of passage. This is the second video that I made for this tier, and my subscribers kindly gave me permission to publish it here for you, with hopes that more subscribers would join this fascinating study. So this video addresses the possible implications of the fact that the world around us, into which we are thrown at birth, so to speak, seems to be yet another level of astrological investigation, not addressed in the natal chart as such. So at least that is what is meant by the principle of Tuchē, which translates astrologically in the topical places from the lot of fortune, also known as the fortune places. So the question is, what is exactly represented by these fortune places? Are they representative of the world around us, the place of coming to be and passing away, the place of the errant cause, as Plato formulated it, where things happen kata tuchein ex anankes, simply by chance, so to speak? So this video will show which two possible concepts underlie this model, the fortune places, and what possible approaches we can use to understand and investigate what is going on there astrologically. So yeah, again, the question is, wouldn't you like to be able to do that for your clients or investigate these issues in your own chart? So yeah, let's have a look at what the possible implications of all this material is or are. So welcome to this second video on this fascinating topic of looking at somebody's chart and being able to see something about their life from a ritualistic point of view, the rebirth experience and rites of passage, which we also call initiations. And it might not perhaps be a difference between them, but it will turn out that the investigation of this is really interesting, and we are able to reach that level, so to speak. So in this video I will be introducing the principles that we will investigate practically in the videos of this tier that will follow. And this is the introduction to what underlies everything that we will take a closer look at in investigating all this material. But it's a very important basic principle, so it's important that you take note of this, and that's why it's the first video of this interesting tier. So it's theoretical for a bit, to be sure, but there are also some practical issues and examples to whet your appetite about what's coming. So let's have a look. So let's start with an experience I had in 2017. We were having a holiday in the UK and we visited Cambridge, and I was much pleased to find this bookshop. And I spent a very pleasant time there, going through their extensive philosophical section, especially the section on Plato, of course. But I walked out also with this very intriguing book that I would recommend to everybody who is interested in Plato's cosmology, especially as announced in the Timaeus and described in the dialogue, the Timaeus. And when you're familiar with Robert Schmidt's work, it is very obvious that he had a long-standing love for the Platonic undercurrent in Greek Hellenistic astrology. So this title, Plato's Cosmology and its Ethical Dimensions, really struck me as an interesting investigation of the Timaeus, the dialogue where Plato introduced his cosmology. And as Schmidt often said, this dialogue, the Timaeus, fascinated all later Platonic philosophers, and most probably the astrologers as well, who were of a strong Platonic bent, as we will see. And me buying it was well worth it, because it's a wonderful and comprehensive study that helps understand both Plato and the terminology Schmidt used all the time in his talks, and this terminology is rampant in this book. So Yeah, it's a very interesting book, and I highly recommend it to anyone interested in the Platonic ideas about the how and why of all the intriguing Greek Hellenistic astrological principles associated with this terminology. That was, of course, the major opus of Robert Schmidt, because he used that terminology many times and also used it to explore in depth the principles that were talked about in the Greek Hellenistic texts. So yeah, that's very interesting, and again, it gave me purchase on what's going on in the realm of necessity, because that's always a very interesting item in all sorts of philosophy. So the realm of necessity, also on virtue, and how Plato gave Schmidt some idea of how the fortune level operates in our lives, which we will study and investigate in this tier. So yeah, so the question that this book asks us readers, and also the time mages, is this: what kind of universe do we live in? How can we coherently explain a world where there is room for both beauty and ugliness, of good and evil? And in what way do these factors interact? And to what extent do they affect our own lives? Well, the Timaeus utilizes a rich conceptual apparatus anchored in the notions of what we would now call intelligent design and recalcitrant necessity to make sense of these ideas. Again, there's the word necessity, which is of course a very loaded fate word. Well, the leading image of the Timaeus employs for this purpose that of an intelligent craftsman, which is called the demiurge, a term that you most probably are familiar with, which and the demiurge is coping with difficult materials, which is the material of the world around us. And Schmidt said in Phase Watch, page 2026, in volume 2, he said the following: the function of indeterminism, or the element of chance in the universe, is a theme which runs through from antiquity to modern times. The most common recurring terms indicating different aspects of the element of chance are fortune, fate, and chance itself, although other terms such as necessity, destiny, providence, predestination, virtue, luck, etc. also enter into the discussion. Now, I talked about fate in other videos, and I even did a special ultimate video on fate principles, so I won't repeat all that here, but it will surface now and then in this course, in this tier. And in this first video I introduced the concepts that are in the background of all that we will be investigating and talking about. Okay, so here goes, and enjoy. Now there are two important ways of understanding the third step, the third level of what's in philosophical terms called emanation, coming from the archetype through the natal chart and into the world, which is the logo that I use here, the steps down, the 1, 2, 3 steps down. You could say them, they are the levels of emanation, and the third one is of course the world around us, and that is a main interest of myself, and perhaps also trying to investigate what is the fortune level and what does it represent in our natal charts, and can we do something with it? And yes, we can do something with it, and that's the goal of this investigation, of course. So let's first have a look at the idea of the downloading principle, which is very important in understanding what's going on in the world around us and how we as individuals interact with the world. Now, in another video that I did on Acuta's Nightlight webinar, in a webinar that I presented there, I used this image of trying to get to grips with what's going on with all this material. So it's actually pretty simple. Suppose you have an idea, I'm going to build a bike. That doesn't mean that by simply having that idea that the bike is suddenly there. It doesn't appear ex nihilo, so to speak. So there has to be something that you work on. You've got to work with it, with the idea, and you got to work with it and on it, and you need to have some material that you need to work on. So it's not just simply there, but it's following a plan, and the plan has to be put into reality. So there are three layers, so to speak, going from the upper level to the most concrete level, the idea going to a concrete form, which is very Platonic, of course. So yeah, there are three tiers, three layers in this process. And that's the reason, the downward path, that's the reason why I always use this staircase as a background in this principle, trying to explain what's happening. It's the path downward. It's going from ideas that are always young and fresh and always available to something concrete and something that can be touched and used in reality. So yeah, there's something that could be called an input, and then you have to work that input, and the idea has to work with the material that is available to us, available to you to realize the idea, I'm going to build a bike. So you got to have a plan, of course, but the material that you're working with has a mind of its own dynamics, and it sort of resists, because it will not be simply put by the force of your mind into something specific like a bike. No, you have to work it, and it's sometimes pretty difficult to make it work. So that's the idea behind all this. So you could say that there is a plan, and the plan is worked on in the workshop, and then you have a product which is built from the building material. And in the Timaeus, this building material is conceptualized as the four elements. And these are really a bit in a chaotic state, because they keep changing into each other. So something has to be put into order so that you can work with it. So that's the basic idea of this Platonic principle, so to speak. So yeah, there you have this imagery. There is a creator that has a plan, and then there's the workshop having the several planets, of course, the spheres of the planets, and then at the bottom you have the earthly realm. So, well, Gabriela Caron talks about this also in a sense. She says the leading image the Timaeus employs is that of an intelligent craftsman or demiurge coping with difficult materials. Well, that's what I just said. The difficult materials is the stuff of the earth, right? With which you try to make something. In this example, you might want to make a bike. So yeah, then she describes how the demiurge does this, and that's interesting because we can characterize the demiurge's activity as comprising different stages, and the interesting thing is she also divides it into three principles. So first, he looks to the forms, and these letters behind it, and the etc. These refer, of course, to the original text of the Timaeus, where this is described. So don't worry about that. That's just simply a reference to the original dialogue of Plato. So he looks to the forms, which is looking at level 1, of course. And the second point is that he wishes that everything should be good or as similar to the eternal model as possible. This is, of course, talking about the demiurge as the designer and the designer of what we now call the cosmos. So, of course, I was talking about something very practical, building a bike, but the demiurge is also about designing the cosmos. So that's what he's doing. That's why this is all such elaborate language having to do with this model and this work like a designer, like a godlike figure, a deity. So He wishes that everything should be good or as similar to the eternal model as possible. And the eternal models are of course the forms that Plato talks about, the archetypes. That's my word for it, because archetypes, I believe, is never used in Platonic philosophy. I believe Schmidt said that Jacob Klein, one of the persons that he admired greatly, talked about the archetypes as the ruling beginnings, which is a very interesting principle, of course. So that's the second thing that the demiurge does. He wants to work it and makes it as good as possible, which is a second level, of course. And then there's a third level. He acts accordingly after reflecting upon the most suitable means to attain his ends, which is the third level. He needs to work the material, and he needs to design and work the plan into something concrete. So yeah, there we have the principle. So in other words, the demiurge has not only a theoretical function by which he apprehends the intelligible order of the forms, but also a practical one by which he sets about imposing this order upon the sensible realm and thus creates a universe as a true cosmos. Interesting. So this basic idea that I explained with my first things in this slide are now described in the more elevated principles that Plato used in his cosmology, of course. So interesting. Now, and then she says again, we can already see how the demiurge appears as a mediator between the immutable forms, those stable paradigms that serve to direct his purposive activity, and our sensible and changing realm. There we have the world again, the difference between the ideas and the reality. He is presented as the efficient cause or principle of becoming and order, genesos kai kosmou arche, there's the word arche again, that organizes the sensible world by imposing on it regularity and structure according to the model that it contemplates. That last one is an important one, and we'll be getting back to that one also, because that's an idea of how we need to address the ever-changing world of coming to be and passing away, and trying to make it into something that we can use or that we can live with. So that's one of the important things having to do with this basic model for this take on what is actually symbolized by this three-tier model that I'm using here. So to summarize here, we have the general idea of this path downward from building plan, which is associated with pronoia, which astrologically is represented by the zodiac and the planets as the deities, via the workshop. The principle there, the fate principle, is heimarmene, which is of course the natal promise, what is your due, and with that we work with the plan and the principles that are downloaded into our natal chart, and with that we work in the world, the apotolesma. So the outcomes of whatever we intend to do is also strongly influenced by being in the world, and as we have seen and argued about, the principles having to do with the world around us offer resistance. They have to do with the four elements, for instance, so they have to put into order to work together with what we are intending to produce. So that's the model having to do with the download principle. We download stuff from our natal chart, we use it in the world, we try to accomplish things in the world by means of our natal chart, and of course with ourselves. But the chart itself is of course a very interesting model to follow, to try to understand yourself as a person, as a living being. What's your natal promise? So not everything is always achieved, and sometimes you need to work hard to get results, and sometimes they come simply quite easily. Again, using the Timaeus, which is of course not addressing natal charts, but has to do with the complete principle of how the cosmos came to be. There's also a three-tier leveled a level in 3 tiers. The path downward is in 3 stages. So the first highest principle is of course God, light, the universe, how it's addressed in the Timaeus. At the second level we have the cosmos, which is created by the demiurge, working with the material of the earth, of course, which is represented by the 4 elements. And you could say that earth is the realm of where man resides, the human beings, of course, where we live, and everyday life is going on there. So in general, there is a plan, which is God, the highest principle. The contractor is the demiurge that tries to work with the plan and make it into an end product. And the end product is the world. This is, of course, a very succinct recapitulation of everything that's addressed in the Timaeus. So I strongly advise you to, in a certain moment, enable yourself to read the Timaeus, which is a very interesting one, or perhaps buy the book that I talked about by Caron, which is only a small part of it has to do with the Timaeus itself, but it places the Timaeus in the order of that is, I believe, the late period of Plato, which is let's say neighbored by 2 other dialogues of Plato. The first one is, I believe, the Republic, and the last one is the Laws, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, you can use that as your reference if you'd like to delve deeper into the philosophical principles underlying Hellenistic astrology. Now, Robert Schmidt had an interesting take on this. He talked about the second level as the possibility and the product as the probability, because the possibility, when we associate that with the natal chart, then that's a sort of a promise. So that's sort of a possibility of things that can be developed, can be put into action when you are the owner of that chart. But as we know, the world works against or with you on several things that you want to realize in your life. And then Schmidt talks about probability, and that's an interesting take on this. This downloading principle is the conception of the fortune level as the end result of something initiated, of some intention on the part of you, the native. So the fortune level then has to do with the outcome of what was intended or put into action. So that addresses the idea how unintentional factors have an influence on your intentions and initiatives, together with our effects and influence on the world around us, because we live here and we've done things and we built things or we destroyed things or whatever. And it's sort of the end product of what we have of what we intended to realize, as I've explained in the previous slides. This is the process of the downloading principle, having to do with how the fortune level, the world around us, works with or against what we try to achieve. So in a sense, you could say that there are, let's say, I'm just proposing this as a working hypothesis, there are actually 2 charts in our lives, which is of course the natal chart, which you see for Frida Kahlo here on the left of this slide, and then we have the fortune places, which might suggest something to do with the outcome. So when you draw that chart anew, then you get, as you can see, different locations of planets, so that might introduce something very interesting. And of course then the question is, the natal chart offers a possibility and the fortune places have to do with probability. So then the question is, can we explain this event in the life of Frida Kahlo with the fortune places? Let me draw the chart with the fortune places, because there was something very heavy happening in her life when on the 17th of September, she was in a severe accident with the bus she was in, where several passengers were killed, and she was impaled with an iron handrail that went through her pelvis. and she suffered many, many injuries. Her pelvic bone had been fractured, her abdomen and uterus had been punctured by the rail, her spine was broken in 3 places, her right leg was broken in 11 places, her right foot was crushed and dislocated, her collarbone was broken, and her shoulder was dislocated. Oh, right. That's pretty heavy stuff, right? Can we explain this by means of the fortune places as the principle of outcomes of a promise? Because when we look at the chart itself, her natal chart, then we see all these planets that are now the ascendant in this chart were in the 12th place. So is that a suggestion that whatever is promised by the 12th place natally as a possibility becomes sort of a reality when we look at this chart? So yeah, that's something we will be investigating. So, and in a cafe she was laid on a billiard table. A man put his knee on her stomach and pulled out the rod of her body as if she, no, let's not go into that. And only at the hospital it became clear how badly injured she was, because everyone expected her to die in the cafe but also on the operating table. So yeah, she had a long life of much difficulties due to this severe accident. So yeah, that's interesting to take note of, and it's of course very tragic what happened to her. And in the end, she committed suicide because, especially because all the things that were needed to keep her sort of healthy or try to deal with all the problems she had because of this accident, which went on throughout her life. So yeah, that's pretty sad, right? Sorry for this small interruption in the flow of the video, but the video will continue, but please consider joining this tier. So again, wouldn't you like to be able to do that for your clients, telling them about rebirth experiences and rites of passage are investigated in your own chart? So please subscribe if you'd like to investigate all this to my new Patreon, Life's Initiations and Trials by Fire, and you can find it here. The video will continue now. As I've said, there are actually 2 ways of understanding the 3rd step level of this emanation, as I'm talking about, and we will be addressing that in this tier, of course. So that's the principle of what I call the uploading of things happening in the world around you. So this is another take on what the fortune level can represent, because as we all know, things simply happen to us in the world around us because of all sorts of reasons, and we have to deal with that. So you could also say that there's an uploading principle of things happening in the world around you that you need to integrate into your personal life or deal with in your personal life, which is the principle of the uploading of these events into your own natal chart in the sense of dealing with them. So this is the principle clearly explained by Forrest Gump, who said, life is a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. And that has to do, of course, with the surprise that the world around us can sometimes offer us by the things that are going on there. So yeah, we need to deal with that. So that's the second take on this. And for that, I'm also looking at something that Plato introduced, which is very interesting to take note of. So we need to talk about the myth of which is in the last chapter, I believe, in Plato's Republic. So what is this about? Well, is a soldier who was killed in a battle, on a battlefield, and he was, when they put up a funeral pyre for all the dead soldiers that were lying there, it turned out that he was still alive. So he woke up and he started talking about what happened to him when he was in the other world, when he was dead, of course, and then in another sphere of experience. So that is what this interesting story is about. So let's have a look at what had to tell us about the principles that were going on in the afterlife, so to speak. So I believe he was led around in the afterlife, in the other world, but this is what he witnessed. So the souls coming from heaven or from purgatory, which was the place under the earth, they gather on the Elysian fields, and there they all randomly choose a lottery ticket from the lap of Lachesis. And Lachesis is, of course, the disposer of lots. To obtain by lot, by fate, or by the will of the gods, and she's the second of the three fates, or moirai, and the three of them together are Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. So yeah, they each choose a lot from this lottery, and then something else is happening. So there they are. And the messenger of Lachesis brings a bag full of lives for them to choose from, and says that not to worry about the lottery because there are enough lives to choose from. So there they go. In the order of the lots, the souls may choose a life. So yeah, this is everything that's going on. So we choose a life, and you can even choose, the souls could even choose the form of an animal. And there's an interesting story that, for instance, Ulysses was there. Odysseus, I'm not quite sure how that's in English. Ulysses, let's say that's the one, and he was there, and he chose the life of a simple farmer because he was pretty tired of having all these trials and tribulations in his life, as we now know in the story of the Odyssey. So that was a bit of a interesting take on how people chose their life. So then Plato says something very interesting, because he says some souls choose too hastily, based on habit, for instance, or because of resenting their previous life or wanting to prolong it. So when you had a very nice, rich, etc., fulfilling life, the souls wanted to prolong that, or when somebody had a very bad life, they resented it and hastily chose something that was the opposite of that. So, and then he says the wise deliberately choose a life that suits him or her, which is of course the opposite of choosing hastily or out of a certain passion for wanting to get another life than the ones that you had led. So, and then he says what your life is meant for was a choice of your soul. So don't blame the gods. And that's of course a very interesting and sometimes even offensive idea in these times when you have difficulties or whatever. That's not what I chose for. Well, Plato says, yes, you did. So what is related to your life's destiny is a consequence of your choice and what is inherent in that choice. But you can not always foresee that or expect some things happening when we choose the life in this how would you call it, pre-reincarnation principle. So that's an interesting one. And then the three moirai, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, measure out the life chosen and attach it indissolubly to the soul. So you cannot alter that what you've chosen. So it will run its course, so to speak. And sometimes you enjoy it and sometimes you hate it. But as Plato said, you cannot blame the gods for that. It's your choice. So, and after all this, the souls, shortly before their rebirth, they drink the water of oblivion in the river Lethe, and some take a sip and remember, and others drink a lot and forget. So yeah, there are moments in life when certain people have a vision or understand, oh, there's something that went on before I was here, before I was born, etc. So we all know the stories, right? And then Plato says, and sudden, or says, it's the myth of suddenly they were carried away from there in all directions upwards towards their birth, just like shooting stars. Well, that also sounds a bit like astrology, right? So there we have a very interesting idea stemming from the myth of is the idea of what your life is meant for. was a choice of your soul, so don't blame the gods. That's a very important statement by Plato, of course. So, but when, to conclude, all the souls had chosen their lives in the order of their lots, they were marshaled and went before Lachesis. And she sent with each, as the guardian of his life and the fulfiller of his choice, the genius, daimon, that he had chosen. The person, right? It's the person who chose a life also chose a daimon that was best capable of let's say, dealing with the life that was chosen. So that's an interesting take on the ascendant, because the ascendant is often what we associate with the daimon that we have chosen. But of course, in Hellenistic astrology, we also have the lot of the daimon. So yeah, that's very interesting overtones here that we need to take into account, and we can philosophize about, because they are pretty interesting takes on what's going on with the person in his life. So let me continue. And this divinity led the soul first to Clotho under her hand, and her turning of the spindle to ratify the destiny of his lot and choice. Ratify is to make it stick, so to speak. And after contact with her, the genius again led the soul to the spinning of Atropos to make the web of its destiny irreversible. So here's a sort of principle of how fate is high marmonet. This is what's promised for you based on your own choice as a soul. And then without a backward look, it passed beneath the throne of necessity. So very interesting take on something that has to do with explaining why we have the chart that we have and the life that we are leading. So yeah, so one is given a choice, but not everything in the scenario is according to the wishes of the soul choosing, nor was it perhaps foreseen. So yeah, that's a pretty wise take on having to do with fate principles, right? So again, life is a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get because you forgot what you chose, or you did not oversee all the things that you that were encompassed in the life that you chose. So it's an interesting take. I like it. Now I want to present something from Plato's philosophy to sort of prove, sort of indicate that this three-tier level was really something that Plato introduced in some form, philosophical form. So sometimes it's a bit difficult to see this, but let's first have a look at the Timaeus. It separates the universe into three tiers. So we have at the highest tier there's God, light, and the universe. The second tier is the cosmos, where the demiurge is working, and the third part is Earth, where you could say that man resides and has to work with stuff. So yeah, that's the principle. And the interesting thing is that this book by Caron sort of underlined this principle in the following text. This is what Plato sort of suggested, and so God would here have a mediating role in enabling humans to participate in the forms. And the forms, of course, are the highest principles that we can achieve, and we would now call them archetypes in the Jungian sense, because they have a great similarity with that. But they are sort of the abstract principles that are associated with everything that is. When you think of a horse, everybody knows what a horse is, and what you see is a principle of a horse, let's say the plan of a horse, but in the world around you, you can see a zillion different horses simply because they are images of the principle of the archetype of the form of the, as Plato called it. So then they are mediating, so the gods. So God would have a mediating role in enabling humans to participate in the forms. For me, that is, of course, the natal chart somehow. The macrocosmos, she continues, in its constant regularity will provide us with a pattern that we should follow in the first instance in order to become truly just and wise. So this is a very interesting principle having to do with, yeah, you could say sort of spirituality, because Plato emphasizes very much that we should study astronomy, and my guess is that that could also be replaced by the word astrology, as shown in the next citation by Caron. A life of justice does require proper education through astronomy, and that's why I would input in astrology, of course, for my readers and everybody who's studying astrology certainly knows this. And that is already sufficient to guarantee a happy life beyond oidaimonia, as it is stated. So in this way, the human ascent towards the form would involve several intermediate levels. There we have them, the three levels that I talked about. Whereas human reason is a daimon that connects the terrestrial side of our nature with the celestial gods. There we have level 2, and I associate that within our natal chart normally. That connects us with the terrestrial side of our nature with the celestial gods. God, in turn, would be a link between human reason and the forms in the first level of paradigmatism, which would facilitate the ascent toward the second level. So there, the second level is, of course, the one, it rises up from the third level up until the second level, and from there it goes to the first level. So yeah, that's, for me, this is sort of a proof that really this three tier model that I'm suggesting in many of my videos actually has a foundation in the philosophy of Mr. Plato. So yeah, that's something that's really, I found that very satisfying to find it in this book, to read about it and understand, well, this is actually talking about a three-tier path, the path upward and the path downward, as I've talked about many times before. So here is a model that I have introduced many times in other videos, but this is the way I come to grips with the principles having to do with astrology and how to understand the many things that we learned from Hellenistic astrology, and trying to put them in a sort of a perspective to understand what's going on and why are these principles perhaps differentiated and to be addressed on this level of a chart and not at the other level of charts. So that is something that I developed studying, of course, Schmitz and his work, and trying to get to grips with it in the astrology that emerged from that. And the principle of moving and being moved played a large role in that. So this is how I, let's say, combined all these principles, and I will show shortly how the fate principles come really nicely into this perspective. So on the upper tier we have the principles. That's simply the principles of astrology. So we're talking about the 12 images of the zodiac, we're talking about the traditional planets being the deities, etc. These are the principles having to do with what is sort of landing in your natal chart, but in a very special way, because it is your natal chart has all these factors in different positions as compared to your neighbor, because each chart is quite unique in a sense. So that means that this inner perspective could say could be representing the things working in your soul, as it is a very interesting model and a very a subtle model of your inner perspective, of your inner personality, and you as a person being alive in this world, and how you interact with your environment, and how you represent yourself in all these things that has to do with horoscopy. But there's also the outer perspective having to do with perhaps the topical places and the fortune places, because these are things that are at work on the soul, because we are sort of, when we are born, we are thrown in this world, We are on a journey, to refer to the nautical metaphor again, on our life's journey, but we are also at sea, and that is the outer perspective. And in that area, things simply happen. And these are the principles of moving and being moved. We are being moved because there are principles that are universal to humankind, simply the astrological represented by the 12 images of the zodiac and the planets and some other principles perhaps. But we are also moving, so the moving part is our natal chart, but we are also being moved. We are either being moved by the higher principles, or we are being moved by the things that simply happen to us and they are at work on our soul. So when we're talking about these principles having to do with the three major principles having to do with fate, then we are talking about pronoia, providentia, which according to Schmidt is not that good a word. Pronoia has to do with a sort of ordering principle, and the ordering principles could be addressed by the universal principles having to do with natal charts, the 12 images and the planets as the deities, right? Then of course these principles land in your natal chart, and then you can say then we are talking about harmaimene, your due, the things that befall you simply because you have this chart, and then the principles are ordered in a very specific way, and that represents your due, and that is bound to you. It has a principle of binding, a sort of a fated principle to you. So you have this planet in that house under these configuration and aspects, etc., etc. That's all specific. That's your due. But then we also have the outer perspective, which is the principle of anankes and Tuchē. Anankes is the things happening to us simply because something was ordered or something was put into place, and then simply works out. So if you plant a seed, then it will necessarily, by force of anankes, simply grow into what it's meant to be, simply the plant that was promised in the seedling. Right, and Tuchē is also the things happening simply by chance, sort of, but not really chance, because we can have a look at it from the perspective of your natal chart, and then we can see that and try to get to grips with that. And that's the really interesting thing about this astrology, because it has a place for all these principles having to do with fate. So that's an interesting thing. So it's sort of the study of fate, but also the principle of getting to grips with what all these fated principles are and how they are represented in your life and in your natal chart, of course. So yeah, beware, stuff happens here. That's the outer perspective, not necessarily following the result of your intentions, right? So, and that's the outer perspective. The things we do on the inner perspective having to do often with intentions. You want to go somewhere, you want to reach a certain goal, and that's intentional. But the outer perspective is things happening that were not meant, were not the result of things you wanted to put into action. So interesting take on that. And that's of course the strength of this astrology. Again, the descent, the path downward, as I just shown with what Plato introduced into, according to Schmidt, in our astrology, and I think he's pretty right with that. So we have a descent, something high up comes down, it's sort of faded, the descent, the path downward, and then it gets ever more entwined in a worldly context. And of course, the idea of light is a very interesting one, because perhaps most of you know that the word Jyotish, which is often called also a referral to Vedic astrology, I'm not quite sure if that's right, but that the translation is sort of the study of light. And of course light is the most, let's say, most obvious principle having to do with astrology and seeing planets, right? So at the highest level we can talk simply about light, and Schmidt made a difference between lux, which is sort of a supernal light, and lumen is visible light. And of course we've all heard about the specific names given to the planets having to do with their light, the way they are shown and the way they are shown in the heavens and the way we see them. So I believe, I'm not quite sure if I put them all right, but for instance Mars was associated with poor races, which has to do with sort of a fierce fiery light, and all the different planets had their own light names, sort of, so to speak. So lumen is visible light, having to do with things that we can see, right? So the shining forth in the natal chart has something to do with how the supernal light sort of comes to work in your natal chart. And then we have the third level, which is the principle of day and night. So there's the difference between light and darkness, right? And of course that's also a very interesting symbolism of this. So yeah, there again we have pronoia, harmone, the promise, what is your due, and Tuchē and ananke. And Plato said ananke, efficient courses of forcible constraint, not acting or cooperating with some other higher cause, according to its own rules and laws. Those events are said to take place, kata tuchein ex anankes, according to Tuchē, by means of ananke. That's sort of a riddling statement that you need to meditate on, I think. But yes, this has to do with the principle where things simply happen. So that's an interesting take on this idea of how light is associated with the planets, of course, and that can also be associated with fate principles. This is also an interesting statement because Schmidt said you can say that pronoia orders all events and interrelates them. So pronoia is sort of an ordering principle, so it makes sense. It orders the principles, and we refer to the highest level to try to come to grips with why is this happening to me. And you can say that pronoia in that sense orders all events and interrelates them. So that's an interesting one. Harmone is the sowing of the seeds, because that has to do with how these things land in your natal chart, and you can associate that with sort of a sowing. And then ananke, that's the principle of this how down here on the earth level. Ananke compels and necessitates the seeds to come to fruition. So that also has to do with a very interesting thing, because ananke might also have to do with the Time Lord methods, because whenever a Time Lord is active, then you can say that then the seed related to that planet comes to fruition, and then it manifests in your life. So again, the very strong interrelatedness of fate principles having to do with our natal charts and how we can associate them with all sorts of principles going on in our lives. So this recapitulates, yeah, that's the right word, sorry. The principles that I've now talked about, and we have to look at level 3, because now then the question is, when we're talking about the uploading principles of what happens to us in the world around us, then the question is, how does the fortune level act upon your life? Or how does it inspire or motivate things that you do? So that's the uploading principle. Let me give you an example chart, because we are now talking about the things that sometimes just happen. Let's say the unforeseen results, possibly of simply being in the world or being at some certain place or whatever. So, but the things then happening to you have nothing to do with your intentions or what you were after. So then it's about the Tuchē level, the world around you having an input, having sort of an uploading function into your natal chart or into your life simply. And Aristotle gave a well-known example of this. So he said, you go to the market to do some shopping, that is your intention, and there you happen to meet someone who owes you money and pays you off. So you get lucky. collecting that was not the intention with which you went to the market, but it happened anyway. So associated with this type of fate, for instance, pure coincidence, we have the fifth place in Hellenistic astrology called agate Tuchē, which which is simply good luck. But you can also have bad luck. You can encounter someone to whom you still owe money and they collect it on the spot, and that belongs to the sixth topical place, kaku Tuchē. So yeah, let's have a look at a chart example that showed the principle of what happened to someone because of the events in the world around her in this case. So this is the chart of Lady Diana Spencer, the late Lady Diana Spencer, who tragically suffered a fatal car crash in Paris. I believe it was in '97. And well, when we look at the fortune places, that's very interesting because we always have to take into account the angles of the fortune location. So as you can see on the left hand, on the right hand side, you can see that fortune is in the lion. So it becomes the new ascendant. And when you look at that chart, you can see, for instance, that her marriage was to a very highborn person, and perhaps you can say that Jupiter is responsible for that, being located in the seventh place from fortune. Interesting, because of course we all know Lady Diana because she married the prince and the future king of England. You can also see the MC where we find Venus, Aphrodite Venus, in her own image of the bull, which is also a very good one for the 10th place, having to do with principles with fame, fortune, and reputation, of course. So, well, that's a very interesting one because we need to take into account always the planets located in the fortune places, in the fortune angles, the pivotal places with respect to fortune. So yeah, you could say that this is what happened to her because this really happened. She married the prince and then all sorts of things happened. But that's the uploading principle because this simply happened. This was her fate, so to speak, a worldly fate. She married a prince and became very famous and very popular. Venus in the 10th place relative to fortune, I guess. So yeah, and that's interesting because you can see in the natal chart that's quite a different take on all these principles. So let's have a look at this and try to see how she dealt with all this. That's very interesting. Now, to do this properly, I have to repeat some things that were taught in other video lessons and have to do with a manner in which we can address things that we can see in a natal chart. So the first thing that I want to address is the guest-host relationship, because that's important, having to do with interpreting what's going on with a planet in a specific image, etc. So it's very important to understand that the guest is the one that gets material offered to him or her, and that is done by the host, and I associate that with the potter and the clay. The guest in a certain image can be understood being a potter, and the host is the one supplying the clay to the potter to do with whatever he would like to do with it. And what the guest is doing with a certain planet has to do with his condition, whether or not it's a benefic or a malefic, etc., etc. All these things come into play, of course. So we're going to look at Mercury. I want to do that specifically because we said in the previous slide, she married a prince, right? And that has to do with marriage, and that marriage is of course the 7th place, and etc. So that's the reason why we're going to look at the image of Hermes, Mercury. Now, Another thing that needs to be understood is the different opinion that we can have about what's called the table of essential dignities. The word dignity is very often associated with sort of a status, but that's not quite right. It has to do with the office that a planet has, and that has to do with the idea that the table of essential dignities is actually a duty roster. And that's a very interesting take on this, and it can help very much in understanding what planets are doing in a chart when you understand planets having a certain duty roster, because the natal chart is of course the first step down from the three-tier model that I've been talking about so often. So yeah, now, so when it's a duty roster, you can say that Mercury has a to-do list. And very simply put, that is the job that Mercury has: provide insight, provide interest, debate things, question things, and doubt things. That's the to-do list of Mercury. The second task is look after any guests in the images of the twins or the Virgin, because that's of course the domicile where Mercury has a specific hosting role. And then the third task is arrange the affairs of the places, the houses of course, that are assigned to you. So, okay. So that's the principle. So we can say that the duties, the chores that Mercury has in this chart is that he is the domicile master of the 10th image, the midheaven, where we find Mars. It's also the domicile master of the 7th place, the host for that image, and it's also having a relation with the 8th place because it's located there. So this is the clay, what I've just enumerated, the clay that Mercury provides for the potter, which is of course Aries, Mars in the Virgin, where Mars in Aries in the Virgin can work with. So what will he do with that? What will this potter make of that? So again, we have the question, what does the guest in the Virgin do with all that material that is offered to him by his host, which is Mercury, Hermes Mercury? So how does he work with that? So then we get to the second question, what is the to-do list of the planet Mars? Well, this is the first one: create problems, create difficulties, challenges, and try to find solutions for them, because that's the task of Mars. And again, look after any guests in the images of the ram or the scorpion, because it's the domicile master, the host of these images. And again, arrange the affairs of the places, the houses assigned to you, Mars that is. So now, the principle of Mars is to sever and to break and to demolish, to cut and separate. He attacks because it's a god of war, and he looks for solutions. He tries to solve things. So that's what he's doing. So yeah, that's what's happening. And where is Mars doing all this? He's doing it in the 10th place, in the public eye. Now we all know, of course, a bit about the history that Lady Diana had with her marriage, which was pretty difficult because there was another person involved, which is now the Queen, who is now the Queen of the UK, of course, the spouse of her former husband. So yeah, that's a pretty difficult one, because we can also see that Mercury is in the 8th place, and that is offered to Mars in the midheaven, in the 10th place, to work with. So we all know of the difficulties that she had and all the problems that were going on in her life due to her bad marriage. And that was again at the end very publicly debated and displayed, and they divorced, etc. And Mars is of course the traditional planet of divorce. So there's an interesting take on this. So you could say that this is the way that the chart promised how she would deal with all these things, but it didn't talk about in what kind of environment or in what kind of principle she would be doing that, because this could also be simply the marriage of a very normal person, not that high in office or not that high in rank or not that popular. And for that we need to look, of course, at the fortune places. So then, of course, we get a sort of another slant on the idea of what the fortune places and as representing the world around us, what they actually represent. And then you could also say that this is how the world saw her, the fortune places. So she was married in High-Off. She had a prince as a marriage partner, which is, of course, almost a fairy tale marriage, of course. And she herself was very popular. She was, I believe she was the most photographed person on the world at that time, and she was, of course, pretty much harassed by many paparazzi. So yeah, that was the tragic side of it, but she was also known as the English Rose, of course, the Rose of England, which is, I believe, the rose is a plant belonging to the significations of Venus. So yeah, this is how the world saw her, of course, but she herself was not that happy with what was going on in all that, and that you could say that the natal chart indicates how she experienced all that. So yeah, this is another interesting take on what we might possibly do with the difference between the fortune places and the natal topical places. Now, I'm not sure if we can really delineate all the fortune places, for instance, her 12th place, where we find Helios, the Sun, and Mercury. Well, perhaps we can. I'm not quite sure, because yeah, but I will go into that later, because it pops up all sorts of ideas when I look at these two charts. So yeah, there's much to be said about this investigation. So yeah, I hope you will be joining me, and let's have a look at all these principles and how they can work. So with all this, I hope I have piqued your interest with this presentation, and and if you'd like, indeed, please join this tier. There will be 2 more slides behind after this one, so keep watching. So yes, on to the next video, and where we further investigate the fascinating material having to do with the fortune level, and perhaps also the specific lots that are associated with it. Of course, the hermetic lots, but perhaps we can also investigate something having to do with the normal lots calculator for all sorts of topics. So I hope to see you there again. Bye.